In the frozen waters off the Alaskan coast in the spring of 1945, one of the most remarkable and least understood military cooperation programs of World War II was taking shape in absolute secrecy. While the world's attention remained fixed on the final collapse of Nazi Germany, thousands of Soviet sailors were arriving at a remote American naval base to receive training on warships that would soon carry them into battle against Imperial Japan. This was Project Hula, a clandestine operation that would see the United States transfer an entire fleet to its ideological rival, the Soviet Union, in preparation for a war that most of the world did not yet know was coming. The story of how this came to be reveals the complex calculus of wartime alliances, the brutal pragmatism of great power politics, and the strange reality that sometimes the enemy of your enemy becomes, however temporarily, the recipient of your most advanced military hardware. To understand why the United States would arm the Soviet Union for a war in the Pacific, we must first understand the strategic situation facing the Allies in early 1945. By February of that year, the outcome of the European war was no longer in doubt. The Red Army had pushed German forces back across Eastern Europe and stood poised to assault Berlin itself. American and British forces had crossed the Rhine and were driving into the heart of Germany from the west. The Third Reich was dying, but in the Pacific, Imperial Japan remained a formidable opponent. Despite devastating losses of territory, ships, and aircraft, the Japanese military showed no signs of surrender. American planners were looking ahead to Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands, and the casualty estimates were staggering. Some projections suggested that an invasion could cost hundreds of thousands of American lives, perhaps more than 1 million when Japanese civilian casualties were included. It was in this context that Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin met at Yalta in February 1945 to discuss the final phase of the war and the shape of the post-war world. Among the many agreements reached at that conference, one of the most significant concerned Soviet entry into the war against Japan. Stalin agreed that the Soviet Union would declare war on Japan within 3 months of Germany's surrender. In exchange, the USSR would receive territorial concessions in the Far East, including the southern half of Sakhalin Island, the Kuril Islands, and special rights in Manchuria. For the Americans and British, this was an enormous strategic prize. Soviet entry into the war would force Japan to fight on 2 fronts and would tie down the Kwantung Army in Manchuria, Japan's largest and most experienced ground force, preventing its redeployment to defend the home islands. But there was a significant problem with this arrangement. The Soviet Union had virtually no naval power in the Pacific Ocean. The Soviet Pacific Fleet, based primarily at Vladivostok, was a modest force consisting of a handful of cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. It was entirely inadequate for the kind of amphibious operations that would be necessary to seize Japanese-held territories and support a land campaign in Manchuria and Korea. The Soviet Navy had focused its limited resources on the Baltic and Black Sea fleets, where it faced Germany and its allies. The Pacific had been a backwater, particularly after the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact of April 1941 had effectively frozen the situation in the Far East. Under the terms of that agreement, both nations had agreed not to attack each other, and for 4 years, while the Soviet Union fought for its survival against Germany and Japan conquered much of Asia and the Pacific, this uneasy peace had held. Now, as victory over Germany approached, Stalin needed ships, and he needed them quickly. The Soviet Union's industrial capacity, while impressive in producing tanks, artillery, and aircraft, was not oriented toward rapid naval construction. Building a fleet from scratch would take years that Stalin did not have. If the USSR was to honor its commitment to enter the war against Japan 3 months after Germany's defeat, It would need ships immediately. Moscow turned to Washington with a request that was both audacious and entirely logical given the circumstances. The Soviet Union asked the United States to transfer a substantial number of warships to the Pacific Fleet and to train Soviet crews to operate them. For the Americans, this request presented both an opportunity and a challenge. On one hand, providing ships to the Soviet Union would ensure that Stalin kept his promise to enter the war against Japan, potentially saving countless American lives. On the other hand, the transfer would need to be conducted in complete secrecy. Japan and the Soviet Union were still technically at peace under the 1941 Neutrality Pact. If the Japanese discovered that the United States was arming the USSR for an attack in the Far East, it could have unpredictable consequences. It might prompt Japan to launch a preemptive strike against Soviet positions in the Far East. Or it could provide Japan with a propaganda victory, allowing Tokyo to claim that the Soviets were preparing to violate their treaty obligations. Either outcome would complicate Allied planning. The solution was Project Hula, named after the Hawaiian dance, though the operation would take place about as far from Hawaii's tropical beaches as one could imagine, while remaining in American territory. The United States agreed to transfer 180 ships to the Soviet Union by November 1st, 1945, and to train 15,000 Soviet sailors to operate them. The location chosen for this massive undertaking was the naval base at Cold Bay, Alaska, one of the most remote and inhospitable places in North America. Cold Bay sits on the Alaska Peninsula, jutting out into the North Pacific, surrounded by volcanic peaks and swept by constant winds. In early 1945, it was a desolate outpost, but it had one crucial advantage. It was far beyond the range of Japanese reconnaissance aircraft. Here, the transfer and training could take place without Japanese knowledge. The Americans moved with remarkable speed to prepare the base for its new mission. By the end of March 1945, just weeks after the agreement was reached, the infrastructure was in place. Living quarters had been constructed or adapted to house thousands of Soviet personnel. Classrooms were equipped with training materials. A movie theater and radio station were established to provide some relief from the harsh conditions and isolation. A sports ground was laid out. American personnel with the necessary technical expertise were assembled, and training curricula were developed. The scale and speed of this preparation reflected the high priority that American military planners placed on ensuring Soviet entry into the Pacific War. The first group of Soviet sailors arrived at Cold Bay on April 10, 1945. They came in groups, transported across the Pacific in secrecy, and they found themselves in a strange and alien environment. Most of these men had spent the war fighting in European waters, or had trained on the Baltic or Black Sea fleets. Alaska was unlike anything they had experienced. The cold was different from the cold of a Russian winter, damp and penetrating, carried on winds that never seemed to stop. The landscape was stark and treeless. Relations between the American instructors and Soviet trainees were professional, but marked by the ideological gulf that separated their nations. These men were allies in war, but they represented systems that viewed each other with deep suspicion. Still, they had a job to do, and both sides approached it with seriousness. The training program was intensive and comprehensive. Soviet sailors needed to learn not just how to operate American ships, but how to maintain them, repair them, and fight them. American and Soviet naval architecture and operational doctrine differed significantly. Soviet sailors were accustomed to different systems, different procedures, different equipment. Everything from communications protocols to damage control procedures had to be taught from scratch. The Americans prepared detailed training materials, often working through interpreters, and conducted both classroom instruction and practical exercises at sea. The Soviet sailors proved to be quick learners, motivated by the knowledge that they would soon be taking these ships into combat. The ships being transferred were not obsolete cast-offs, but capable warships that the United States Navy itself was using in the Pacific campaign. The transfer included patrol frigates, vessels designed for convoy escort and anti-submarine warfare. There were minesweepers, essential for clearing the approaches to enemy-held harbors and beaches. Large landing craft were provided, the workhorses of amphibious warfare, capable of carrying troops, vehicles, and supplies directly onto hostile shores. Submarine hunters, small but fast vessels equipped with depth charges and sonar, were included to protect Soviet task forces from Japanese submarines. Even floating workshops were transferred, mobile repair facilities that could keep a fleet operational far from established bases. This was not a token gesture, but a serious commitment of military resources. As spring turned to summer in 1945, the pace of the program accelerated. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8th, which meant that the clock was now ticking on Stalin's promise to enter the war against Japan within 3 months. That deadline would fall in early August. The training at Cold Bay continued around the clock. By the time the program concluded, the United States managed to train 12,000 Soviet servicemen and transfer 149 ships to the USSR. The original goal had been 180 ships by November, but events would overtake that timeline. The ships that were transferred proved to be enough for Soviet purposes. Throughout this entire period, the operation remained secret. The Japanese never discovered what was happening at Cold Bay. Soviet personnel were forbidden from discussing their mission, and American security was tight. The location itself provided natural security. Cold Bay was so remote that accidental discovery was virtually impossible. The secrecy was essential because the Soviet Union and Japan were still observing the Neutrality Pact concluded in 1941. If Tokyo had learned that the USSR was preparing for war with American assistance, it would have constituted a clear violation of that agreement and could have prompted Japanese action. The maintenance of the fiction of Soviet-Japanese neutrality was important to Stalin's planning. He wanted to choose the moment to strike, not have it forced upon him. That moment came on August 8, 1945. 2 days after the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, and 1 day before a second bomb would fall on Nagasaki, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. The timing was no coincidence. Tutut. Stalin had watched the development of the atomic bomb program with great interest, and he understood that the war might end suddenly. He was determined that the Soviet Union would be a participant in Japan's defeat, and would thus have a claim to influence in the post-war settlement of Asia. At 1 minute past midnight on August 9th, Moscow time, Soviet forces launched a massive offensive into Japanese-held Manchuria. The Kwantung Army, once the pride of the Imperial Japanese military, was overwhelmed by the Soviet onslaught. More than 1.5 million Soviet troops, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, crashed through Japanese defenses in a campaign that military historians still regard as a masterpiece of operational art. The ships transferred under Project Hula played their role in this campaign. The Soviet Pacific Fleet, now substantially reinforced with American vessels, conducted amphibious operations along the Korean coast and moved to seize the Kuril Islands and southern Sakhalin. These operations were not without cost. During the landing on Chumshu Island on August 18, 1945, Soviet forces encountered fierce Japanese resistance. Chumshu was the northernmost of the Kuril Islands, and its garrison was determined to fight to the last. Japanese coastal artillery, well-positioned and expertly handled, engaged the Soviet landing force as it approached the beaches. 5 of the large landing craft transferred by the Americans were sunk in this action, taking their crews and the troops they carried down with them. The battle for Shumshu continued for several days and resulted in heavy casualties on both sides. But eventually, Soviet forces secured the island. It was one of the last significant battles of World War II. Japan announced its surrender on August 15th, though the formal surrender ceremony would not take place until September 2nd, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. By that time, Soviet forces had occupied Manchuria, northern Korea, southern Sakhalin, and the Kuril Islands. The speed and scale of the Soviet offensive had shocked the Japanese high command and contributed to the decision to surrender. Whether the atomic bombs or Soviet entry was more decisive in forcing Japan's capitulation remains a subject of historical debate. But there is no question that Stalin's decision to enter the war, enabled in part by American naval assistance, reshaped the political geography of post-war Asia. The aftermath of Project Hula was shaped by the rapidly deteriorating relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union. The wartime alliance was already fraying even before Japan's surrender, and within months, the Cold War would begin in earnest. The ships transferred under Project Hula were subject to the terms of the Lend-Lease program, the massive American effort to supply its allies with military equipment during the war. Under Lend-Lease, equipment could be returned after the war, retained for a fee, or destroyed under American supervision. The Soviet Union, facing enormous reconstruction costs and increasingly hostile relations with its former allies, was reluctant to pay for the ships or return them promptly. Negotiations over Lend-Lease debts would drag on for decades. Eventually, most of the ships transferred under Project Hula were either returned to the United States or disposed of under American supervision. But the process was slow and contentious. The historical significance of Project Hula extends far beyond the immediate military impact of the ships themselves. The operation represents a moment when the logic of war temporarily overcame ideological opposition. The United States and the Soviet Union were never comfortable allies. American leaders harbored deep suspicions about Soviet intentions, and Stalin trusted no one, least of all the capitalist powers of the West. Yet, faced with a common enemy and the prospect of a prolonged and bloody campaign to defeat Japan, both nations were willing to cooperate in ways that would have been unthinkable before the war and would become impossible afterward. The fact that the United States was willing to transfer a substantial fleet to the Soviet Union, train thousands of Soviet sailors, and do so in complete secrecy demonstrates the extent to which defeating the Axis powers took precedence over all other considerations. Project Hula also illuminates the degree to which the Soviet Union's entry into the war against Japan was a calculated decision driven by territorial and political ambitions rather than ideological solidarity with the Allied cause. Stalin had no particular desire to help the United States and Britain defeat Japan. His interest was in securing Soviet gains in the Far East and establishing the USSR as a major power in post-war Asia. The territorial concessions promised at Yalta were the price of Soviet participation, and Stalin drove a hard bargain. The United States was willing to pay that price because American military planners believed that Soviet entry would save American lives. In retrospect, with the benefit of knowing about the atomic bomb's impact, some historians have questioned whether Soviet participation was necessary to defeat Japan. But in the spring and summer of 1945, before the bombs were dropped and their effects fully understood, Soviet entry seemed essential to Allied strategy. The ships transferred under Project Hula served in the Soviet Pacific Fleet for varying lengths of time after the war. Some were quickly returned or scrapped. Others remained in service for years, their American origins gradually forgotten as they were repainted, renamed, and integrated into Soviet naval doctrine. The sailors who trained at Cold Bay returned to the Soviet Union, and most of them faded into obscurity. The operation itself was classified and remained little known for decades. It was not the kind of story that fit comfortably into either American or Soviet narratives of the war. For the Americans, it was awkward to acknowledge how much assistance had been provided to a nation that would soon become the primary adversary in the Cold War. For the Soviets, it contradicted the narrative of self-reliance and Soviet military superiority that dominated official histories. Today, Project Hula stands as a reminder of the complexity of World War II and the alliances that won it. The war was not a simple story of good versus evil, though the Axis powers certainly represented a profound evil that had to be defeated. It was also a story of competing national interests, pragmatic calculations, and temporary partnerships between nations that had little in common beyond a shared enemy. The United States armed the Soviet Union not out of friendship or shared values, but because it served American strategic interests at a crucial moment. Stalin accepted that aid and used it to advance Soviet power in Asia, setting the stage for decades of Cold War competition in the region. The legacy of those decisions is still visible in the political geography of Northeast Asia. The Soviet occupation of the Kuril Islands, enabled in part by the naval power provided through Project Hula, created a territorial dispute between Russia and Japan that remains unresolved to this day. The Soviet occupation of Northern Korea led directly to the division of the peninsula and the Korean War, with consequences that echo into the present. The establishment of Soviet influence in Manchuria and northern China contributed to the communist victory in the Chinese Civil War. In ways large and small, the decision to arm the Soviet Union for the war against Japan helped shape the world we live in now. It was a decision made in the desperate circumstances of total war, with the best information available at the time, and it had consequences that no one could have fully predicted. That is the nature of history, a series of choices made under pressure, with incomplete knowledge, that ripple forward through time in unexpected ways.